We all owe a debt of gratitude to the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, for bringing us together to discuss this vital topic today of the European Union's Corporate Sustainability and Due Diligence Directive from a development policy perspective. Now, a couple of notes on housekeeping for the session. The event will be recorded and made available by BMZ as soon as it's by tomorrow or late next week. Secondly, while you have seen from the agenda, there's no question and answer session, BMZ will welcome any feedback from you and will be happy to answer any questions that you submit to them. Now, BMZ's intention for this event is really to bring together diverse voices from government, business and civil society, north and south, to investigate the opportunities and the challenges from for the Due Diligence Directive to promote sustainable development. Effectively, how can we make this new directive work for developing countries, and especially for the poor and vulnerable in those developing countries, many of whom, as we know, are in our supply chains, providing Europe with the clothes in our cupboards, with the food in our cupboards, and also with the mobile phones in our pockets. How can we essentially ensure that this final directive due next year helps to really drive shared prosperity and indeed shared security, including the climate security, just as Pakistan is currently coping with unprecedented floods and the Philippines experienced 200 kilometers per hour winds only this last weekend. So what I'd like to do now is move straight to our keynote speaker, Dr. Bärbel Kofler, the Parliamentary State Secretary for the Federal Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development. Dr. Kofler, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Phil, and ladies and gentlemen. And first of all, I would express a warm welcome to everybody who is participating online or maybe also in a personal discussion and in personal. I'm very happy that you all joined us in that discussion, and so many of you are joining us today and tomorrow. I think it's very important because the Corporate Sustainable Due Diligence Directive is really a strong lever to improve working and living conditions of so many people working around the globe, along the supply chains. And a good law can protect those people from exploitation, create decent jobs, and protect the environment. And that is what it's all about. We want to make progress in that process, and that is also one of our development goals. Well, an effective European Corporate Sustainable Due Diligence Act is a milestone on the path forward, making globalization more equitable. It has the potential to trigger social and ecological transformation of our global economy. And well, we were coming up with a supply chain law in Germany last year, and that was an important step for us. But a European law will enable us to achieve a much bigger impact because it covers the second largest economic area in the world. Well, the German government is campaigning for a law that effectively protects human rights. I want to underline that effectively protects human rights. It must make a difference on the ground because it's about the people who are affected by violating standards and violating laws. And it doesn't matter if that is somebody at a sewing machine with working hours of about 14 hours a day, if it's somebody in the mining, in the extractive natural resources, or if it's even worse, children who are forced to work in a factory or in mines because their parents don't earn enough money to make the living for the family. It's about their lives, and that's why the directive is so important. That's why also in our national perspective last year, the law was so important. So it's about working conditions of the workers, and it's of living conditions of all their families. And I have to underline, and I really want to express that always in circumstances like that, I've seen that myself. I've seen children working in a coal mine. I've seen textile workers being exploited. So if you see that once in your life, you never forget it. And I think that's the important event why we are joining hands and joining forces to work for a meaningful directive. So saying that, it's about defending interests of workers. But of course, there are so many companies who are also supporting the European directive because they also want to have a level playing field. They want to have fair standards. They want to have responsibility along the supply chain and don't want to have child or forced labor in their products. Well, the European legislative proposal includes important elements of ensuring respect for human rights along global supply chains. And I'm pleased that the entire German government is supporting a law that goes beyond German law. Well, first of all, bigger companies are required to present strategies for how they will align their business model with the 1.5-degree target. This is important for ensuring a holistic approach because we must make sure we do not play social and ecological criteria off against each other. And together they provide the framework for a sustainable business model. And the second, and that's also beyond our national law, there will be civil law liability. This is important because it provides the people whose rights have been violated with an opportunity to get reparation and justice. And companies that violate human rights, tolerate child labor, or destroy the environment must be held legally accountable. When we made the German law, we agreed that this issue would be addressed by European level, so as to create a level playing field. And this agreement is now finally being realized. And however, the new law cannot be effective unless it's implemented by all stakeholders and along the whole supply chain. We thus welcome the appeal made by the European Commission in Article 14, namely that all member states support the stakeholders in their endeavors. And it is important that the role of civil society and of multi-stakeholder initiatives be recognized and supported to the same degree as companies. We in the German government are working at all levels, and we are working together with all stakeholders in Europe and in our partner countries. We have carried out a mapping exercise in order to assess the German government's activity. So we are carrying out approximately 60 ongoing measures with a total volume of some 500 million euros that are helping to improve social and environmental standards in supply chains. I'll give you one example. In Vietnam, we are supporting the creation of a help desk for companies that advises them on human rights and environmental standards. And we are promoting the practical implementation of such standards, for instance, by advising factories in partner countries on fire protection measures. We are also strengthening workers' rights, including in Bangladesh, where a cross-sectoral compliance mechanism has been set up with our support. So we see our engagement in Germany as a part of a pan-European approach. That is why we are lobbying for a Team Europe initiative to coordinate and to connect the measures carried out by the different member states. We know in this context, of course, that other member states, such as the Netherlands, for example, from whom we will hear today or later on in our meeting, and others, that they are carrying out mapping exercises so the EU-wide approach can be coordinated more effectively and the remaining gaps can be closed. We as Team Europe already agree that we want to set up a joint help desk. It will assist companies and governments, civil society and multi-stakeholder initiatives here in the EU and in our partner countries. It will provide them with information on the new directive and advises them on how to implement it and connect with them with funding measures. And the members of the Team Europe initiative, probably most of you know already, will meet in Brussels on the 6th of October, where they can in detail discuss the next steps. So we also invite international organizations to that meeting to talk about our collaboration and the division of labor. Because it is important to coordinate measures at an early stage and as comprehensively as possible, so that all stakeholders are well prepared for implementing the directive. This is also one of the goals of today's event. I'm very pleased, therefore, that so many of you are participating today. I find it important to hear your viewpoints from all parties, from decision makers as well from suppliers and workers, and at the end of the supply chain. And we need to consider the full picture when negotiating the directive. Well, today we will be discussing the broad lines of the EU directive, and I'm also pleased to invite you for tomorrow's meeting, because tomorrow we will talk about a specific element of the supply chain law. We will have an exchange about where we stand on our journey in ensuring living wages in the textile industry and how our international cooperation and pioneering initiatives can be strengthened further. Well, I look forward to inspiring discussions today and tomorrow, and I all invite you to participate even beyond that event we have this week here in Berlin. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Koerfler. That's excellent. And thank you very much also for really emphasizing the transformational nature of the law that we need, particularly in terms of these areas such as child labor and sweatshops that are across the supply chains that feed Europe and provide such wealth and benefit to us. I think that issue about the interest for workers, the benefit to business through level playing fields, the legal accountability that's necessary, and the proper implementation, as you've described it, with the support measures that are necessary. Those are all critical points for us. So let me now introduce the first panel, which is the Policymakers Roundtable on ensuring our impactful directive. The moderator is Ellen Bronsky, Department Director for Business and Human Rights at the Danish Institute for Human Rights. As you all know, the Danish Institute has a long and distinguished record for working with a broad network of partners and allies across the globe, with a focus on the UN guiding principles and its implementation at the national level, and especially in the Global South. We've worked very closely with them ourselves as the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. So we're all very grateful for Ellen for moderating our next panel. Over to you, Ellen, to introduce the panel.
Many thanks, Phil, and good afternoon to everyone. So in this panel, we will be discussing how the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive can effectively improve working conditions and living conditions along the supply chain. We have three distinguished panelists that I will hand over to in a minute. Let me just introduce them quickly and give you a little bit of background on where we are in the negotiation of the directive. So we have three speakers, Belbert Kopfler that you just heard, Parliamentary State Secretary to the BMZ, as well as Rachel Davis, the Vice President of Shift and a long time advocate of business and human rights. And we also have the pleasure of having a member of the European Parliament, namely Timo Völken, who is a member of the Committee on the Environment, Public Health and Food, if I'm not mistaken. So as we all know, in February this year, the Commission introduced this proposal for a directive. We're all very eager to see a directive adopted, and it seems like the Parliament now is reviewing and discussing the directive. There will be a vote in plenary in May next year. And in parallel, we have the member states debating in the Council. And Commissioner Reynders indicated last week that he was hoping that the Council would have a general approach to the directive towards the end of this year or maybe early next year. And then, as we know, the trilogue phase will start. And for those who are not too familiar with EU policy making, this means that the three bodies will have to reach a compromise. And it is hoped that by 2024, we will have a directive, which will then be transposed by member states. But of course, looking at the details in the directive, there's been a lot of debates around which ones are important, which ones are well framed, which ones need to be improved. So maybe I'll start with you, Rachel, to give us in a couple of minutes your overall view of the directive, keeping in mind this overall objective that the directive has, which is bringing an improvement of scale to respect for human rights and the environment along global supply chains and value chains. So Rachel, over to you for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Eline, and thanks to BMZ for the invitation to join this discussion today. So as we've heard, this is a directive to amend EU corporate law. But as we've also heard, the impact that it's intended to have is in the daily lives of people. So yes, in EU companies' own workforces, of course, but really importantly for today's discussion and for the success of the directive, for workers in the value chains of those companies that extend well beyond the EU and their families, as Dr. Kofler rightly said, for local communities around their operations, and for consumers and end users of their products and services, and of course for the environment in its own right as well. And if we want the directive to be effective, meaning to prevent harm, but also to have the greatest possible positive outcome in people's lives, then we need to design it with this definition of effectiveness in mind. So from our perspective at Shift, the really good news is that by more firmly grounding the directive and specifically the due diligence duty in the international standards that exist in the UNGPs and the OECD guidelines, we can be more confident that it will have its intended impact. That's because the international standards themselves were designed to drive better outcomes for people and planet, while providing a practical blueprint for risk-based due diligence that's manageable for business. So we're hearing a lot in the debate right now about what risk-based approach means. And I wanted to put 5 quick features on the table, I think, when we talk about this approach. What are we talking about? What can make a difference? So very briefly, first, severity. Companies should use the lens of risk to people to identify impacts right across the value chain, not just where they have established business relationships. And then they should prioritize according to where the risks to people and planet are most severe. Second key feature, contribution. So risk assessment should include all the ways in which a company could be involved in an impact, which means taking a hard look at the company's own purchasing practices and its sales practices and its business model and strategy to make sure it's not contributing to impacts itself or making it harder for its partners to meet their responsibility. Third, leverage. Companies should be collaborating with their partners in third countries, not just engaging in contractual cascading, and they should use creative forms of leverage to build their capacity and encourage them to take action. Fourth, and this is really fundamental, engagement. Companies should engage with affected stakeholders, not those who are the most vocal or the most influential, but those who may be the most vulnerable and the most impacted. And they should do this at specific moments in the due diligence process. This, of course, includes trade unions, and it, of course, includes many stakeholders outside the EU. And finally, accountability. So the directive should ensure meaningful accountability through both administrative supervision and civil liability, as we've heard, where a company caused or contributed to harm. And it's worth recalling that access to judicial remedy is a foundational principle in the state duty to protect. And that includes tackling legal and practical barriers like the burden of proof. So in sum, I think we need to pay more attention to severity, contribution, leverage, engagement, and accountability. These are the key features of a risk-based approach. And we know that the Council under the leadership of the Czech presidency is looking at these issues, and the draft provides a framework for us to further integrate them. And that should appeal to all stakeholders, because I don't think anybody is really interested in or benefits from investing in processes that are disconnected from actual outcomes for people.
Many thanks, Rachel, also for reminding us that we do have a number of instruments, including the UN guiding principles, that can guide us in looking at whether the directive will be effective in ensuring respect for human rights along global value chains. Now turning to you, Timo, you have been involved in the discussions, I guess, at the European Parliament. So please give us your overall view of the directive.
Yes, thank you very much, Ellen. And Bärbel, thank you very much for inviting me and for allowing me to present the view of the European Parliament. I'm indeed the rapporteur of the ENVI Committee's opinion to the lead committee, the Legal Affairs Committee, which is the committee which will be in charge. But I'm also a member of the Legal Affairs Committee, so that's an easy situation for me, so I can defend my own ENVI opinion. And let me start by stating the obvious. The Commission's proposal is indeed a landmark win towards mandatory corporate due diligence throughout the European Union. However, that does not mean that it is perfect already. As it stands, the Commission's proposal depends on a more or less checklist approach, which may lead to the law becoming a paper tiger rather than an effective framework for combating human rights, climate and environmental law violations worldwide. And this is especially frustrating because we have great, but unfortunately non-binding blueprints for due diligence in form of the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And these frameworks demand that companies are proactive, prioritize and use a risk-based approach to investigate and to address potential violations. And for us, Social Democrats in the European Parliament, it is crystal clear that we need to return to this risk-based approach, which the Commission unfortunately did not choose, that is focused on results and dialogue with stakeholders rather than paperwork in order to avoid liability. And besides the risk-based approach, comprehensive coverage of harmful environmental and human rights impacts is central in order to make impact where it matters, which is often close to the source of the raw materials and in early stages of the manufacturing processes. It will be important that companies are asked to consider and address risks and impacts in their whole value chain, including downstream impacts. With regards to the human rights and environmental impacts listed in the annex themselves, we will need to make sure that they reflect all adverse impacts in these areas, not just a selection. In particular, we need to make sure that all environmental risks are accounted for, as well as those related to issues such as gender, rights of children, rights of indigenous people, workers' rights, and animal welfare. And when it comes to the scope of the directive, every company will be affected in some way, whether or not they are directly included in the scope. We should therefore try to actively include also smaller companies, rather making them subject to larger companies' demands in the due diligence chain. And this is what is happening according to the draft, to the proposal by the Commission. So we need to provide small and medium enterprises with clear and proportionate rules to their involvement and responsibilities, and to protect them from abuse from larger companies when necessary, for instance, by preventing contractual cascading. And lastly, one question this directive should ensure companies can answer is, who owns due diligence? The work of compliance, legal, CSR, and even PR departments often has links with due diligence, but in the end, responsibility can be opaque or even hamper due diligence processes. For a proactive due diligence process, we need to make sure it is integrated in the day-to-day running of a company. And part of this is ensuring that directors and company boards must have a minimum oversight of all steps of due diligence. And this is where I want to put a focus in my report of the Environment Committee to the Legal Affairs Committee.
Many thanks, and we're already getting into very specific provisions where I hear you here that they could be improved. So that's great. I'm sure the other speakers will be able to react to that. Now turning to you, Bevel, you already, of course, gave an overview of BMZ's position with regard to the directive. But please also give us a bit more about what you think would make it effective in terms of contributing to improving people's lives.
Well, thank you for that opportunity. I will be very brief because I had my time before already a little bit. But one thing which is very important for me is that it is really a shift from voluntary to mandatory. Timo was pointing that out a little bit, but I think that's a total shift in the mindset. If it's not a voluntary, nice to have thing, if a company is fulfilling UN Declaration of Business and Human Rights or standards, but they have to. So I think that is very important, because what we don't realize maybe is how much we are actually depending, or how much products we are importing in the European Union, which were produced by exploiting other people or exploiting the nature. Just an example, well, most of you know that child labor is about 160 million affected children in the worldwide, but we are importing in the European Union 50 billion euro worth products, which are based on child labor. And I think that makes it crystal clear that we have to act, and we have to act mandatory and not on voluntary assumptions or voluntary acts of single enterprises and companies. Well, and it was pointed out, it has to be a risk-based approach. The important points were already mentioned. What I want to say is that it's really important that it's not only for established business, as we've read in the beginning of the discussion on the directive, because it has to be for any kind of business and not only for those who have established business contacts. When I first read that, I don't know where this concept was coming from. I was a little bit surprised, because that was a debate we didn't even have in the German parliament. Or not even from German Business Association. And I think that would be a big hindrance for really effective measures, because what about new initiatives? What about just short-term initiatives? What about the risk that established business relationships then would be broken down to new and newly framed relationships? So that is something, and I'm quite happy to say that we reject in Germany. And what I think what is important also are those things which were already heavily debated in our national law finding procedure. So I think I pointed it out, we need liability under civil law. That is very important. And of course, we need to frame those things where we in our national law were not able to frame enough. And that means environmental standards, like was pointed out. It means also that some some standards we didn't frame enough if it's coming to gender equality, for example. I think that's important. And in the end of the day, it has to be implemented and it has to be controlled. So the question how we implement it, on the one hand, with supporting enterprises to do so, and I'm totally agreeing, especially support small, medium enterprises that enables them to implement and fulfill the standards. And on the other hand, at the end of the day, to really control the obligations of the law. I think that's another important point for our further discussion.
Thank you very much. We've also been hearing in the public debate about a risk of companies actually leaving difficult markets because it would be too difficult for them to live up to the due diligence directive, or in fear of future liability, that they would cut and run from certain difficult partners. So I wanted to ask all of the panelists to react maybe to this. Is that something that you also fear, that companies might, rather than engaging with the issues that they have along their value chains, maybe choose to go to less difficult places where there are less risks for human rights or environmental abuses? And how do we counter that through the directive? Maybe Rachel, first to you.
Happy to kick off. Yeah, I think there is a risk with the original drafting that it might incentivize that kind of behavior, but I think everybody is quite alert to this in the debate now, as you say, Ellen, and I think that the Commission's draft provides some hooks already for how to improve and strengthen those parts of Articles 7 and 8, particularly about the kinds of expected behavior that could counteract that. And it goes back a bit to what I was saying about what mindset are we asking companies to bring to this? Are we asking them to bring a management of risk to themselves, legal risk to themselves, or management of actual better outcomes for people? And if it's that latter mindset driving towards better outcomes, then strategies around collaboration, engagement, capacity building, but strategies that companies can be held accountable to. So it's not just an open-ended time frame to generate certain outcomes in a particular business relationship. There has to be targets, there have to be milestones, it has to be measurable, right? You have to be held accountable for that by stakeholders, by administrative supervisors. But I think it's possible to design that into the legislation, and that picks up on points that Parliament has raised already and that we know are active in the Council discussion.
Excellent, thank you. I'm asking you the same question, Timo. What do you think we need to change in the directive to avoid companies leaving?
Yeah, first of all, I think I can more or less echo what Rachel just said. So yes, there is the risk that companies just decide to leave a market, but the Commission's proposal makes it clear that leaving should be a last resort, and obviously you cannot force a company to stay in a country, but by extending the scope of the due diligence law, we would prevent that there is cherry picking. So if you cannot do it in one country, your practices, you leave the country and establish it in another one. There would also be illegal or affect your obligations according to the due diligence law. So I think the answer is indeed a strong due diligence law, which covers many companies, and so we, of course, will hold companies accountable if they violated workers' rights, for example, or violated environmental laws, and they cannot simply run away. And we will make this, we will put this into place by also, in addition, a very or a strong liability clause, at least when it comes to my view on the proposal. So my answer would be, first, make sure that many companies are covered, and make sure that the law is indeed enforced, so that it's not possible to change from one country to another, and hold companies accountable.
Thank you. Belwel, do you have any thoughts about this?
Well, maybe I would ask the question the other way around. How many companies do not invest in certain countries because they don't have a certainty that basic human rights like no child labor, no forced labor are respected? I assume there must be also quite an interesting amount of companies who are saying, well, we don't want to get involved in that, and that's why we don't produce in country X and Y. So this level playing field debate, I think, plays also a role. And it's not only that countries are leaving, maybe countries are investing because you can guarantee better by a strong directive that there is a legal framework which is supporting a law-based order. And honestly speaking, this slogan, well, then we will leave the countries in the south and it's not to their benefit, that's something we heard through the years advanced to the German lawmaking procession and to our decision here. And if it's a serious complaint and a serious concern where we can debate on how we can support with the help desk, if we can make clear that this is about a process, like it was said by Rachel, to get engaged with your partners, with the workers on the other side of the supply chain, I think that can take away a lot of fear. But I get also the experience that it's not a real fear, but it's something for hindering a strong law or a strong directive. And I think we should have a close look who is arguing with that.
Thank you. And I heard also that some of you mentioned this risk of checkbox compliance, and that, you know, companies might be doing paper due diligence with a view to avoiding liability. Is that something that that you also fear, Rachel?
For me, I think, again, it comes back to strengthening the parts of the duty that need to be more closely aligned with the international standards, because the international standards are fundamentally about creative approaches and meaningful approaches to managing human rights risks. So let me take an example of living wage. If this directive is designed the right way, adopting and implementing a living wage commitment throughout a value chain is going to seem like a logical way for companies to address a whole multitude of human rights impacts. Because we know that not having access to a living wage or a living income for those who are self-employed can lead to huge problems with lack of access to education, to health and well-being, to nutrition, and to economic and social opportunity. The list goes on. But we also see the benefit that cascading a living wage and really doing that, right, driving the outcome, not just a paper commitment, can have. And you do that by collaborating with your business partners, by having honest conversations about how to make that happen, by looking at your own purchasing practices. You know, the companies that are doing this have to undergo some hard work to do it, but it's work that can pay off in terms of better outcomes for people all along the value chain. And if the directive can incentivize approaches like that, then I think we're going in the right direction.
Great, and thank you also for reminding us that, you know, this can also be a situation where companies win and they have, you know, a better value chain at the end of the day. Maybe we don't have much time, so I just wanted to make sure that all of you also have the opportunity to comment on what kind of supporting measures you think that the EU and EU member states should be taking to support also businesses, including small and medium-sized enterprises, including businesses in the global south, but also third countries outside of the EU, so that they can live up to the directive. We already heard, Bärbel, that the German government is supporting through different instruments, programs and initiatives. But what else do you think that the EU and EU member states should be doing? So maybe first to you, Bärbel, on this.
I think that's a very important topic, because it's not only about blaming companies or assuming that everybody is doing everything wrong. It is about enabling everybody to really hinder or prevent human rights and violations and the violation of environmental standards, for example. So we have quite a good experience, I think, with the help desk we established in Germany, where a lot of companies really seeking support, what to do in certain circumstances in certain countries. what are the risks, what should be done to come up with a proper risk analysis. I think this help desk is important, and we would be really glad to have a Team Europe initiative on a kind of help desk like that. So there is a big supporting system then for the companies engaging in the Global South. And it's also about, like Timo was pointing out before, about especially small, medium enterprises, because obviously there's a bigger need for support than it is for global players and big companies. So to establish that, we are doing that already a little bit through the BMZ. So we have a funding through the KfW, our development bank. And that started with smart solutions, especially for small, medium enterprises, especially in the Global South. And I think that's important also. It's not about only our companies, but it's about the cooperation and what enterprises in the South, especially small and medium enterprises there, can do and how they have to change. We started in financing that with, at the moment, about 50 million euros. For this special topic. And I think that is something we have to discuss in the European Union, how we really can spread ideas like that. One sentence only, last sentence. What is important is that there's, of course, has to be a strong monitoring of everything which is done. It's a process, and it's also a learning process in how we establish the measures which we found by the risk analyst, how we are establishing then new procedures, but it has to be monitored. And that means civil society and especially trade unions have to play a big role also in this process and have to be included. Multi-stakeholder initiatives, and there has also to be a support from a help desk side and from a financial side, not only for the business side, which is necessary, but also for civil society, trade unions, multi-stakeholder initiatives who want to monitor and who want to invent or come up with new ideas to prevent human rights violations.
Yes, thank you. So support for SMEs, including in Global South, and also support to CSOs and trade union. That's very important. Rachel, what about your thoughts about supporting measures?
I just say I think we're going to need to get much better about how we understand the investment of time that's needed to address systemic challenges and root causes in key third countries, and indeed within some EU countries too, but without losing the sense of accountability for making progress. So that means we're going to need criteria for where there are collective initiatives that companies and others are participating in. You know, how are we measuring their progress? Is it actually contributing to outcomes? How do we know? National regulators are going to also need to be able to evaluate, you know, the sense of time needed, but we have to be confident we're seeing progress. So I think that's going to be a really important theme in whatever accompanying measures are agreed. But I would just also say that I'm looking forward to hearing what the next panel has to say on this picture as well. I'm sure they're going to bring some very direct insights from their own experience.
Absolutely, and thanks for bringing in the issue of collective initiatives and how we measure those against the directive. Timo, a few last words from you on possible supporting measures?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I can underline what Bärbel just said. It is really important that we also improve the stakeholder engagement across the entire value chain. It is for companies much cheaper if an adverse effect is addressed very early. And you need the people on the ground who are working there, who are affected by the conditions, to be able to report, like trade unions, NGOs, other representatives of workers in local communities. So this would be very important. And as Bärbel said, if this is also maybe supported in a financial way, this can foster dialogue, and stakeholders can engage with each other, which is absolutely necessary to really make due diligence law successful.
Many thanks, and indeed, I'm sure the next panel will also look at how we can strengthen civil society to make this even more efficient. Thank you to all, and look forward to the next panel to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ellen, and thank you to the whole panel for your contributions, Rachel, Timo, and Bärbel. I mean, for me, it was so interesting. First of all, the emphasis on the most vulnerable, the impacted workers, indigenous, and women and gender-based violence. Secondly, that effort on directors' duties, and that the responsibility for due diligence must remain with the directors of companies. Then also this interaction between essentially this fallacy of cut and run, with also the need, therefore, for us to strengthen that level playing field through the rule of law and enforcement across different countries to stop any country hopping. The excuse that essentially that vested interests are using that to try and prevent an effective directive, I think, is very important. And then finally, just that emphasis that Rachel gave also on things such as the living wage as the means by which companies, by paying a living wage, can really facilitate a whole other set of rights of their workers and the communities that they are there to, that are serving them in terms of creating the profits, whether it's the right to food on the table or a roof over a family's head, or whether it's also the issues of health and the education of children. So that was a fantastic panel. Thank you very much. So moving straight on now to our second panel, which focuses on the perspectives from the Global South and therefore builds very much on that first. It's an honor, I think, for all of us to have Fernanda Oppenheim with us today, the chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. She's going to moderate this second panel as co-executive director of PODER, which is an organization in Latin America that's dedicated to corporate accountability. Fernanda really has a lot of hands-on experience of how business conduct really affects right holders on the ground, and also which regulatory and normative changes and shifts make a real difference to rights and opportunities of communities and workers. So Fernanda, straight over to you.
Thank you very much, Phil, and nice to be with everyone today. It is my honor to moderate this great panel. I think it's going to be a very interesting conversation, bringing perspectives from the Global South. I am myself Latin America, and I have been accompanying different communities on the ground for many, many years, as well as workers and unions. So I think this is a great opportunity to bring this perspectives into the discussions on the EU directive, as it will have a great impact in Global South as well. So, the aim of this session is pretty much to hear from different voices in the Global South. What are their expectations? What are their hopes? And also some concerns and the recommendations for the discussions that will come around the new due diligence legislation before it gets approved. And, I think this will definitely inform the debate on, not only the different components of the European draft legislation, but also the potential impacts on the Global South, which is, I think, something that should be taken into account by the decision makers. So with no further ado, I will introduce our panelists. We have Alex Azanvo, the Executive Director of the Initiative Cacao Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, and Mamadou Diallo, Deputy General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation. Unfortunately, our colleague Joanne Carling, Global Director of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, won't be able to join us due to the typhoon that is currently hitting the Philippines, which is interrupting, internet access and communication. So we hope they stay safe, but unfortunately, Joanne won't be able to join us today. So for this first round of introductory remarks, I'd like to give the floor to first to Alex for 3 minutes, and then to Mamadou for another 3 minutes, and then we'll circle back with some questions. Please, colleagues, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And again, thank you. First of all, let me express my gratitude from Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, the two countries I represent, and excellencies and everyone here. For us, it's great to have such conversation because we see, and it's still there, we still talk about only environmental and social issues, so human rights. But we need to acknowledge that clearly we are in a situation where at the end, these are the issues where we are missing the root cause, which is poverty. So how do we crack poverty? So the third pillar of sustainability is economic. That's why we have this three pillar. And the economic element is lagging. And I think I heard at the end of the previous panel, but it's very key. We are talking about massive changes that are required for businesses, but also for government, importing and exporting countries, and then farmers. So how do we drive these changes in a continuously commoditization environment? So we are talking about commodity. So I'm in charge of cocoa for the two countries. We are facing all the massive challenges of a free market, so-called free market. This is creating the poverty that we are facing. And it's not the only problem. And sometimes we talk about price, but the biggest issue is how do we transform the sectors? So decommoditizations to move into a commodity market that is creating value. Today is not happening. And we see in Europe, the current situation of gas and electricity, which we are facing into cocoa and many other raw materials every day. This is really hurting. And we hope that the conversation on legislation will start connecting this third element of sustainability, which is economic. How do we create the right incentive to drive the right behavior? If we want to protect the planet, we need to take serious actions. We can't let business operating and just doing ticks the box, paperwork, just to please regulations. We need to build transformation of the sector. So I wanted to say thank you to everyone here and I'm looking forward to the conversation later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex. Please, Mamadou, go ahead with your first initial remarks and then we'll come back with some questions for you on the panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mrs. Fernanda. Thank you also to BMZ for involving the ITUC, which represent the voice of workers in this panel. It is very important for us to participate and also share our view in the perspective of this EU instrument. We have a number of elements that is the basis of our position and how we appreciate this perspective. First, 90% today of workers producing goods and providing services to global companies are hidden workers and not directly hired by their economic company. We all know that in those sectors, there is a real deficit of decent work, as recognized by the ILO. The COVID-19 pandemic has also exposed the fragility of global supply chains and the enormous risk to human and labor rights in highly interconnected global economy that is not governed by the rule of law. From also our Human and Trade Union Rights Index, we have seen in many regions of the world, almost all the regions, that there is a violations, and abuse of labor and trade union rights. It's also seen that when we look at the existing international European voluntary guidelines, codes, and charter, and their implementation, we see how difficult it is for those instruments to effectively respond to the situation, to the existing situation in terms of respect of human and labor rights. And maybe what Dr. I think Koffler said, we need to reflect on how we probably are going to move from voluntary perspective to mandatory perspective in implementing the instrument. This is why for the trade union movement, human rights due diligence legislation on supply chains will play a central role in addressing all these gaps I have already raised. But these directives can only be efficient if it follows what I'm going to say, the consideration that I want to share with you. First, the directive should place the focus on protection of victims and right holders. It should also be, there should also be an obligation to conduct human rights due diligence and impose it to all companies, regardless of their size, structure, or ownership. We think also it's important that enterprises' human rights due diligence obligation should be monitored by a competent public body, and violation of such obligation should carry effective and dissuasive sanctions. The directive should also ensure effective and easy access to justice for affected people and victims, including representation by trade unions, broader liability, proper remedies, and dissuasive sanctions. We also think that it is important that the directive should ensure the full involvement of trade unions and workers' representatives throughout the whole process of identifying, prevention, remedying and enforcing human rights violation in the design, monitoring and enforcing and envisaged due diligence tools and instruments. It is also very important for us that this instrument made clear that the right to freedom of association and collective bargaining are right in themselves. Meaningful stakeholder engagement on due diligence does not replace the company's obligation to respect the choice of workers, to form trade unions, and to engage in good faith collective bargaining over terms of employment and working conditions. To conclude on this, we think that the European directive should be seen as a means to combat real and potential abuses and make companies accountable. Holding business accountable for their violation must be the foundation of a new business model. Any mandatory due diligence legislation should aim to transform the current economic model into a fairer model with rights for workers and civil society and protection of the planet. That's, Madam, what I wanted to share with the panelists, and I'm ready to respond to some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you brought some very important elements that actually combine very naturally with some of the things that were shared in the previous panel about taking into account the right holders, different groups, you know, with special protections, but also specific vulnerabilities. And I think it's very important that the voice of the workers is heard in this context, as many times, unfortunately, in our business and human rights discussions, you know, unions or workers are not represented adequately, in my perspective. And I apologize for the noise. I live in a very, very noisy city, Mexico City. I'd like to come back to you, Alex, and I think, you know, we have a few questions to be discussed, and one would be, you know, of course, what considerations in your perspective and from your experience with communities and workers, what considerations must decision makers take into account when drafting and implementing this directive, if they want to decide to achieve positive impact and avoid negative effects on the global south? And also, you know, what lessons can we learn or conclusions can we draw from experiences with other regulations around corporate due diligence or different measures, both voluntary or mandatory? So if you'd like to start to address some of these elements, and then we'll circle back to Mamadou, and then maybe we do another round the other way around. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Right. So thank you very much. Yes, that was there are a lot of questions, but I'll try to get them in order. So first of all, here, you know, I'll focus a little bit on some of the area I'm in, right? So when we talk about cocoa, so the majority of producers are smallholders. But also when we extrapolate bigger, so the global food supply in this world is mainly produced by smallholders. So when we talk about legislation, the first thing we need to think about is accompanying measures. So it's how do we support these smallholders to comply and to build the transition to achieve the expected outcome we are looking for, all right? Mainly protecting the planet, protecting the people. As you know, smallholders farmers are receiving very little from the overall shared value of most commodities, right? Simply because this is the way the business has been designed. And if you look at it, that means that there is a very lack of investment in new farms, practices, or even workforce, which are the reasons why we are talking about building around the root cause, which is how do we crack poverty and how do we look at the economic aspect. So by thinking that way, we could see that this transition is needed. So we can't talk sustainability from today to tomorrow. We need that transition to understand how long it's going to take for this poor farmer to reach some of the requirements. Because very easily for company, it will be straightforward, very straightforward for them to comply, which is paperwork, doing traceability, and sign off, cut and run if needed, etc. And I think we heard in the previous panel. But these are some of the concerns we have. How do you ensure that we are all committed to the transition from where we are today to where we want to be tomorrow? By achieving this will require some reset on what type of businesses or purchases mechanism we need. Because one thing I said earlier, the price formation of most of this raw material are not taking consideration cost of production. So the farmer are operating by loss. If I take the example of cocoa, for example, since the COVID, so despite price mechanism set up by the Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana government, today, this price system is being challenged by the businesses simply because it doesn't create the return they're looking for, meaning more earning. But then when you look at the past 3 years, most companies have reported record profits. And in the meantime, since we launched a new price mechanism in 2019 called the living income differentials, so farmers have been facing challenges because we government, we base the farm gate price on farm export price. So the export price has been decreasing since 3 years, constantly down. So today the result is deficit cocoa production in Côte d'Ivoire, in Ghana, almost 30% to 35% deficit. So illegal mining is grabbing lands. So farmers are desperate. They're looking for immediate cash, and they have to abandon the farm in certain cases due to security risk. And this is amplifying. So we are seeing all these things, but then we are seeing record profit from companies. So how can we implement proper due diligence if this is at the end not delivering the return back to the poor farmer. I think that that's for us critical. And again, this is real, because if we don't create it, so we are going to create a vicious circle, which is more poverty will create more young people outside. And you could see in West Africa, we are observing the increase of terrorism, the increase of insecurity in our regions, right? Simply because there is more people desperate. And beside that, you see more people trying to come to Europe. And we need to look at this as a bigger picture to ensure. So due diligence is one step, because we believe that that will help bringing transparency. That's a positive part. We will know where companies are buying. So also meaning that we will know what's the impact of each company. There is too much claims on sustainability, but today are proof point where some of the claims, when you look, represent probably 5 to 10% of company supply. So how can we create the impact if companies can go elsewhere, diversify, and change and claim sustainability when it's not delivering the output? So these are the things that we are looking for in terms of legislations. The transparency is critical. We welcome it. And we believe that we country are also developing national traceability system. We are building mapping to ensure that we know where the forests are, we know where the farmers are, where protected areas are, to ensure that we can also bring our duty. So this is a partnership. But again, if we are not creating the right incentive, it's difficult for us, producing countries, to ensure the consistency on explaining to the farmers why is needed, because then how do you get to protect forest or to ask people to protect the forest if they don't see really the needs? Because if they do nothing, they can still sell the cocoa. And again, we are talking about indirect supply and so many things in the cocoa sector. That shows that we need to get this right. And getting it right is not just about tick the box, but we need to look at the price formation and the market functions to ensure that we can deliver the right incentive. So these are some of the elements that I can bring here, but I don't want to be too long. I'm happy to add if needed. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think you bring some very important elements around, ensuring consistency and also the complexities of price formation, how the market also behaves. And this would be my follow-up question for you, but let's just pause it for a second about, how can we avoid with this directive that more trade barriers are created to suppliers in the global south? But maybe you can reflect on that for a moment while we hear from Mamadou, and we'll come back to you. So please go ahead, Mr. Diallo. You're on mute still.
Yes. I think we should avoid that this instrument be an additional instrument as we are used to see, without giving any difference. I think what is important and what is expected from the workers is that this due diligence instrument to be effective and implemented in such a way that it changes the situation of workers. As we mentioned it, we have seen it all over the world, that today more and more workers are exposed, mainly in the supply chains. They are women, young people, but also they are children. If we take the case, what is happening in Congo, what also is happening in some areas of the cocoa sector, and Mr. Alex can confirm that if in Ghana, in Cote d'Ivoire, many children are working in the fields. This is very important to be addressed, and I think we need to put companies facing their responsibility in this perspective. We know that in many cases, and we experience it, that usually when you raise grievance in the supply chains, the response from the manager is to say, I have to call London, I have to call Paris, I have to call New York to get instruction on how I should behave with you, meaning that there is a huge gap between what is happening on the ground with those who are the top responsible of the company. This needs to be solved, and I think this instrument should take this into account. This is why we insist on the process of the monitoring, but also on the sanctions to be taken. Of course, in the instrument we have so far, what we see is we insist more on voluntary basis instead of being able to take sanctions against companies. And one issue is very important, and I think in the first panel it was raised. Many companies, when they know that there are strong unions in some countries or strong civil society that, and with a strong instrument at national levels that protect workers, what they do, they just move in another country or in another region or sub-region. This is also something I think the instrument should address, and we should frame it in such a way that everywhere you go, you will be obliged to comply with the instrument and its provision. I think this is what has trade union movement we claim in this perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that that gap that you both have, very clearly conveyed that exists between, this, what happens at the European level or of the, the big buyers or the big brands and the transnational corporations, and what happens on the ground with, workers, with suppliers. There is a huge gap that I think we also see from the working group perspective that should be, addressed somehow. For example, as Mamadou, as you were saying, the different barriers to access to remedy, how grievance mechanisms are established, and how can we really ensure, hopefully, how can this directive ensure access to grievance mechanisms and adequate remedy, by eliminating the different structural barriers that there are in this sense. So I think that's a great element that you're bringing. And Alex, let me circle back to you then, and maybe the question I was posing and anything else you'd like to reflect as we're approaching the last 5 minutes of this conversation. Oh, please unmute yourself.
Yes. So your question were related to barriers, and I think that's some of the elements we look. So we have economic partnership agreements. There are different rules around the world. Some of them are crossing the way. So very clearly, that's the way business is operating. But we believe that it's important that we all think about what are the right transition. What are the transitions we need to have to ensure that the tools are being implemented rightly with the right accompanying measure. As I said, the accompanying measure is not only at farmer or worker level, but it's also in terms of policy. So what are the local policies that need to be put in place? How do we ensure that some of this being implemented? Because policy doesn't mean implementation, and we have seen several policy not being followed. But on top of that, one of the biggest risks we would like to call out is the cut and run. And the cut and run is something we have been observing a lot in the cocoa sector, simply because this is easy. But on top of that, I heard saying, oh yes, there's a lot of child labor, etc. But this is another issue, because when we talk human rights or child labor, we need to ensure that we are talking about decent income is also a human right. So if a family cannot afford from the product they are producing or for the work they are doing, they cannot afford the minimum. So how can we now telling them, well, you need to ensure that your children won't go there and there, etc. So that is vicious circles that we are looking, and we want to ensure that there is a massive kind of a thinking on how do we build to the right level. It's critical. And to close, we are calling again the European Union. So we have the due diligence, we have the deforestation, but we also have many more legislation coming. Let's bring all this into a full package at some point, because it's becoming a lot of complexities that we can see creating additional burdens in terms of how the market will operate. So we are seeing now a new pillar on businesses. So business has been operating on a way. Today, sustainability is becoming a business, but this has to build the right return back to the farmer and cannot undermine the producing countries. So that's critical. Why we say that? This is because more and more we see this being as a selling point. And then the farmer is now looking, okay, where and how do I get my product being sold in the market? And parallel to that, everyone's talking about modernization. So plantations, farms, then undermining all the effort that are being there. So we want to protect the planet. So we need to look about people. And we are calling a massive reflections while we are implementing all this, looking always at the reward. What's the incentive for the people that are working, for the people that are producing these raw materials we are looking for? And let's use the rules that are existing, like ILO, to ensure that we are not overclaiming issues, but be aware that for us, this has become serious. So the more people that are losing jobs, the more people that are getting less and less, is creating the situation we are all facing. And security combined with current crises that are creating food security issues. So thank you very much. And I think we are all in.
Thank you.
We'll continue looking at it together.
Thank you very much. I think one element you're bringing, policy coherence, should be at the heart of these discussions as well. This is something we also recommend always from the working group. And then coming back to you, Mamadou, for a brief final reflection, I was thinking about the fact that you gave us a very shocking number of almost 90% of what you called hidden workers. And, you know, and I think one of the things that hasn't been addressed fully is what happens with outsourced workers, right? And the draft directive talks about established business relationships. So what happens when that is not there from the perspective of the directive, which I think it's not fully aligned with the UNGPs, by the way. So just a few seconds for your
yes, this is very clear, and I would like also to share what Alex has said, except on the child labor. I think poverty could not justify a child labor. This, I think you need to be very clear on that. Yes. Because in many cases, what you see is that companies avoid to give work to parents and use children. And this is something we need to fight. Of course, it is related to many other poverty, etc. But this we can also elaborate. And this,
I agree. I can agree.
We don't have that. When we are talking about the 90% of hidden worker in the supply chain, it's the reality also, because those people didn't have a genuine contract. Those people couldn't organize themselves as trade union movement and expose their grievance. Those people can be sacked anytime. And if we come into the issue of wages, they are not getting fair wages. This is why we think that if we are in the perspective of setting a new instrument, this instrument should come to make the difference, to respond to those problems and those issues. This is what from the ITUC perspective we fight for, and I want to say that we are engaged in the discussions. We are involved in also in the debate for this instrument, and will we continue provide our contribution till we get the end of this, and hopefully we think it will be an efficient one. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you. I'll take it. I'll send it back to you, Phil, in just 1 second. I really want to thank our great panelists, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you to the organizers and of course the German government. And I hope we continue the discussions. Thank you so much. Back to you, Phil.
Thanks very much, Fernanda, Mamadou, and Alex. Fantastic discussion again, really bringing to life what it is for workers and communities to face these conditions. I think what came out very strongly was the issues of poverty and inequality, the way that drives much of the impunity that's in these long and intercontinental supply chains, interconnected supply chains, and the way in which this kind of law can change the calculus of risk in some of the boardrooms, where up till now there's been an understanding that they can externalize some of their environmental and social costs. And what we've heard just now is very much about the bringing of those costs back into the boardroom, so that companies really do have to think about the way in which they're creating significant risks, environmental as well as social risks. And I thought that work around the supply chain law going across the supplying countries, and therefore potentially changing the relationship between brands and the suppliers, can be incredibly powerful. So thanks very much for that. So I'll move now to our third panel, which focuses on what constitutes an effective smart mix of accompanying measures at the European Union level. So this brings us back to the European Union. It's going to be moderated by Julia Otten, the policy officer in the responsible companies team of Frank Bold. You'll all know Frank Bold, the influential law firm. It's based in the Czech Republic in Eastern Europe. That's very important for us to get that Eastern European voice into this discussion. And Frank Bold is driven by that desire to protect the environment and human rights and promote the rule of law and democracy. It's got long-standing experience on corporate accountability. So without further ado, Julia, over to you.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you so much for the introduction. I would actually like to invite you all to another slight change of scenery and look ahead even further into the implementation of the proposed directive together. So we've been hearing some discussion on accompanying measures already in the first and the second session. Many thanks for that, and we will hopefully pick up some of these thoughts in this final session. The EU Commission is proposing these accompanying measures in Article 14 of this directive in order to effectively implement the directive across all sectors and across global value chains. And there are actually three issues that we are looking at in more detail in this last session. One is, who actually needs what kind of support? And secondly, building on that, what makes accompanying measures effective? And we've kind of touched upon some of these debates in the first and the second panel. And thirdly, the issue of coordination at EU level. How do we avoid duplication? How can we build on each other and on the work that's already out there? So I would like to propose to start in a similar fashion as we did with the other panels, and ask all of the four panelists, which I warmly welcome, to start with a short statement, to keep it brief so we have some time for questions. And if I may, Cecile, start with you as head of unit at the DG for International Partnerships at the European Commission. From your perspective, who actually needs support for doing what in order to effectively implement this directive? And what's the role of the Commission that you see in all of this, also in comparison to the companies or local communities that have a role to play? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and many thanks, Julia, for giving me the floor. I was listening with great interest to the panel before on cocoa also, and the great contributions that have been done already. And just before the event, I was here in Brussels in the Ghana embassy, because we had a big event also with the Minister of Ghana on our project we have to add value to the coffee and cocoa value chain and bringing into sustainable dimension. So this is answering a bit your question, Yola, in a way that, of course, we have foreseen accompanying measures as part of the regulation. And by the way, the directive, I'm not part of the new rules, the directive is not yet in force. It will still take some time, but we need to start preparing the grounds for it. And I think the meaning where we stand from it on accompanying measure is really to sort of allow companies that are creating more value added and to embed really sustainability into their activity. And what I mean companies is really the SMEs, the farmers, further down the chain, our support is primarily there, focused at suppliers in our partner countries, farmers, the workers, so that they understand what it means, due diligence and environmental and labor practices, and translate it in the way they do business from the start, and taking it really as an opportunity rather than as a burden. I mean, it's easier to say, of course, with words, but I do believe that our partner country, for example, with Ghana, which I was discussing just before, instead of using, for example, fertilizers, they have great also resources from the ground and from their practices, and to green practices. And this is exactly that kind of spirit that should be there and should really guide how we conceive the support measure we want to do. So helping really further down in our country, partner country, farmers, small businesses further down the supply chain to have sustainable practices, so that at the end, corporate sustainable due diligence is something that is really embedded into the way that they do business, and then they can really further down put themselves in a competitive role to be able to supply the products also further down the chain and to enter the EU market with a very good position.
Thank you, Cecile, so far, and maybe we can touch upon the EU-wide coordination in another wrapping up round. Then, if I may pass it on directly to you, Caroline, as the Trade Policy and Economic Governance Director at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands, a country that has gathered some experience in setting up accompanying measures, if I may summarize it like that. What are your experiences with the existing support measures, multi-stakeholder initiatives, platforms, etc.? What do you think is key to really address the stakeholders that Cecile just mentioned?
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation. It's very good to be here today at a time where this discussion is very timely as well, given that we are moving forward in terms of legislation also in the EU. We think legislation is very important when it comes to responsible business conduct, but more than that, we need a smart mix of measures to really achieve the change that we need. I can take you briefly to what we do and have done in the Netherlands so far. We've had extensive experience in responsible business conduct, and we've done that mostly through voluntary RBC agreements. So we have motivated companies, private sector, NGOs, trade unions, and helped also by our government to engage in sector-wide arrangements, for example, in textiles and also in finance. Those have worked to some extent, but the outcome of our policy review on those was clear. We need additional measures. So that has resulted in the Netherlands into a smart mix of measures to reinforce responsible business conduct. One of the key measures being legislation, which we also intend to implement in the Netherlands. We think a very important element for the whole set of measures is that it is coherent with the OECD guidelines, because those have shaped the efforts of businesses so far for over a decade and will continue to do so. So we think consistency with that is very important. We think legislation is an effective tool, in particular for those who are currently lagging behind, but we need to look at the entire value chain and make sure that businesses have enough to implement it in the right way as well. We are complementing, therefore, our efforts for legislation by a set of measures. And those measures are aimed at informing businesses, facilitating the implementation, to incentivize them, but also to set conditions. If I can give examples for each of those, informing by giving businesses tools and information on due diligence through an RBC support office, a one-stop shop, if you may. And this one-stop shop will be open for businesses shortly. I think it could be comparable to the help desk that was mentioned earlier for Germany. We already have a CSR Risk Check, which is an online tool which companies can identify the potential environmental and social risks in their supply chains, and then address it also in line with OECD guidelines and UNGPs. We incentivize, have done so in the past, and will continue to do so by financial support. We have in place subsidies for companies, but also for the NGOs that are willing and able to engage in these voluntary agreements. When we go to legislation, this instrument will take a slightly different form, but it will be an instrument where we continue to subsidize those who are working on responsible business conduct. And we're hoping that by these sectoral arrangements, companies will be better equipped to prepare for legislation in the future. We also set conditions. We do so when it comes to due diligence in our public procurement contracts. So we have requirements on due diligence before we, as a government, buy products from the market. Maybe a little bit towards the supply chain and where we see examples of what countries in the production countries would need to become a partner in responsible business conduct. We think here too, we need a local involvement, a local multi-stakeholder approach. We have one example, it's called the Sustainable Trade Initiative, between governmental bodies of the cocoa producing countries and leading chocolate and cocoa companies. Those have collectively committed to end deforestation and restore forest areas. Those cocoa initiatives are an example of a platform that is vital to bringing all stakeholders together and to ensure that they can live up to the requirements and the higher standards. What else can I say? Well, yeah, important also to have existing and new measures and best practices to become widely available so that people can actually learn from those. And we have a global living wage database that companies in producer countries as well as EU companies can access. And I may conclude by saying that you've mentioned it before, we need a smart mix like this or a European action plan on RBC that is broader than just the legislation. It's mentioned in the directive, but I think we have to give it, we have to still shape it further and be sure that we can support the businesses in achieving their goal when it comes to responsible business conduct. Let me leave it at that and see what questions arise further. Thank you.
Many thanks to you, and I would love to come back to that, making it more concrete and how we can actually shape it and what we should add in terms of how it's framed now by the Commission proposal. But before doing so, I would like to hand over to Axel and ask you to bring in to this discussion as a Director for Economic and Social Development and Digitalization at the GIZ, this more developmental perspective. What is key from that policy perspective in providing accompanying measures? We've talked a lot about workers and farmers, and that's an area where you probably have some insights to share with us in terms of your work and your background.
Yes, thank you so much. Happy to be here and to share some views from clearly the perspective of a practitioner. But while listening to the colleagues, in particular to the last step. And I've also learned that I think what we do in Germany is not too different from what other countries are doing. I think my starting point would be here that development cooperation, the practical development cooperation for sure, can play a very important role to bring closer together and maybe even to reconcile even the different views we have heard of today. I think we have had a first round of statements made by policymakers, and we got the taste of the European discussion. And in the second round, we got the taste of the more global South discussion. And I think development cooperation, that will be the general statement, I think has really instruments and tools to bring those perspectives together. And I think this is something where we come from. Looking at our experiences and at the portfolio we have tried to develop over the many years, I can first say for sure, in development cooperation in Germany, what GIZ is doing in our sister organization, there's a broad experiences in supporting countries and setting up sustainability measures in the supply chains. I think what is now new as a challenge to us is to gear those measures better to the requirements of the dynamics of the legal framework in Europe and elsewhere. Which is actually not trivial, as development cooperation typically would not be perceive itself as a tool to facilitate legal the enforcement of legal requirements. But I think what we have tried to set up, I think some elements have been mentioned already. First, for sure, we have said we have to make sure that the information is out to the business communities, that the businesses, the companies, in particular the small and medium-sized companies, really understand the issues we are talking about. And in this realm, and I would clearly recommend this also as an area for European intervention, joint intervention of the different European partners, I think it's clear that business communities need to be sensitized, to be informed. They should definitely know what those requirements are all about. I think this is certainly one element here. The second is, I think our starting point was also that from the experiences we have gained over time in many sectoral initiatives, we have tried to put forward, be it in the textile sector, or we have started recently to do more work on electronics. We have well-established programs on agriculture, value chains. I think what we can see here is that in those initiatives, and if we pursue a partnership approach, I think this is the basic hypothesis here, we can enable stakeholders to develop capacities to implement those requirements. So I think definitely also in the, if we start discussing how we can best accompany the implementation of the European directive, we should for sure also implement those experiences from those sectoral partnership and initiatives. And thirdly, and maybe this is also important really to appreciate the scope of activity that can be expected from development cooperation, the practical arms for sure. I think this is that we can bring in the partner's perspective. And I mean, for sure, the perspectives of the target groups, but also, and maybe this is equally important, the perspective of frameworks and legal frameworks, in particular in institutions in our partner countries. I think it has been mentioned already that we want to support countries to avoid that countries would actually withdraw as a response, as a reaction to a future European directive. And I think what is very important from our point of view, that we design measures, that we design support measures so that the actual frameworks in those countries can be improved, that the countries and the respective administration will be enabled to enforce national laws so that companies that invest there, international companies, have it at least to a certain level, not a guarantee, but a certainty that if they produce or source from those countries, that they are in accordance with European law. So that is what I wanted to say, and I have some more aspects on a more European initiative and how we can better also cooperate in Europe, but maybe we can do this in a second round. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and very happy to come back to these European initiatives in light of the time. But I would like to, in due time, sorry, but I would like to hand over to Monique and ask you, as Impact Innovation Director, coming from Fairphone, when you look at your value chains, how do you deal with support, and how do you make sure that there is effective support for whom in your value chain?
Yes, thank you. And first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. I think we've already heard a lot of very interesting things, which will probably come back in, how we work as well, and how we on how.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you well. Maybe.
Can you hear me now better?
That's a lot better, thank you.
Yeah, okay. But let me quickly first, for those that might not know Fairphone, explain what Fairphone is about. So Fairphone is a Dutch smartphone company. We have a mission to inspire the industry to act more responsible. And we do that, we want to do that by showing that you can design a phone in a more environmental and fairer way, that you can make them and recycle them also in a more circular and fairer way. And within this, we mainly focus on the one hand, allowing users to use their phones as long as possible, but especially also we focus on catalyzing the fairer labor conditions and living conditions for the workforce in our supply chain from factory to mine. So that's especially what we're looking at today. So we've certainly welcomed the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence regulation as a level playing field. However, we indeed really think it's key that it comes with the right supporting measures, and then especially when we look at our suppliers. So we see that especially our upstream, but also midstream suppliers really require that support because adapting the practices that are required to live up to the standards that are asked from a due diligence perspective. And it was already said before, it really takes time and it takes money, it takes effort. And that should not be underestimated. And the time and money that needs to be invested can and should also be partially carried by the companies that bring the product to the markets, like us, like Fairphone. It for sure should not only be by the suppliers themselves. And that is why, for example, we provide a living wage bonus to the workers on the production line of our assembly manufacturer. And we also support mine sites in the DRC, in Uganda, in Rwanda, there where it's most needed to work with better protection and also had to ensure that the mine workers earn a higher income, for example. Then when it comes to what we believe should be additional measures also coming from the European Union to enable and complement this, to support those midstream and upstream suppliers, we think that on the one hand, financial support is really needed because again, it costs a lot of money to get mines safer, to get them less polluting, to ensure that the right infrastructure is in place, to enable children to go to mines, to schools instead of mines. And those can be significantly large, those investments. So we need to do that together, public, private sector. But maybe even more important, and I think that was also clearly mentioned by the different speakers in the former sessions, is that what we need is a due diligence method or framework that rewards those value chain actors, companies that actually choose to invest in continuous improvement and in collaboration, especially again with the marginalized suppliers, because that is those the mine sites, the cooperatives, they need it most. The contradiction is, however, that it's especially there where human rights and environmental standards are not yet met, because there is the highest risk. need it most and need our support and our engagement most. But the risk is that we push them out because we can't ensure then that we can live up to the highest standards that are asked from a compliance perspective. So I think that is really key, that we find this mechanism to also, and this space and this rewarding mechanism to reward continuous improvement, investments, especially there where the standards are not yet met. And of course, these require the right, KPIs, the right reporting, etc., because you do need to see and show progress. That is the key point I wanted to bring to the table today.
Thank you so much, and thank you for talking about this share of responsibility, which is also something that is quite key for many different aspects in this directive, I think. There are so many follow-up questions, but we have a little time left in this panel, so I would like to sum up the two directions I would like you to look into in a closing round. One is, we've talked about bottom-up approaches, really targeting workers and this issue of delivering on the return. What does it need from accompanying measures to really deliver on that towards local communities? And if we look onto the other side, like moving it all the way up to the governmental, intergovernmental level, on the European Union level, what additional comments would you have on the coordination of these measures so that they work well and they work together in the way that they are set up? Sorry, and I would like to start with Cecile again.
Thank you, Julia. And so I will answer also taking back the previous questions that you had mentioned, but I thought I was just supposed to reply on who needs supports. But this is, of course, and I think Axel and also Caroline talked about it. What we want to do as regard accompanying measures also at EU level is try to work closely with EU member states, but also international organizations, because for the moment there are quite some number of things being done, but I mean, the coordination and complementarity of those is probably not optimal yet. So we don't want to recreate a whole new set of things, but very much base ourselves on what exists already and complement it in a way that it makes it clearer and more practical also for the actor I was talking about before. So SMEs, the farmers, and further down the chain. I know Monique also mentioned the mid-level of suppliers, so processing a little bit, but in between. So all this sort of get clearer guidance, clearer tool for them, and put that all together and do it together with member states. I mean, colleagues from Netherlands were here, but we have also put together this Team Europe initiative with 8 member states so far. We have Belgium, France, Germany, of course, leading the work, and many others member states part of it, where we try to pool our resources together and divide the work nicely. And of course, the sort of idea of having, and I think Caroline was also mentioning it, a one-stop shop or platform or help desk where basically small enterprise farmers in different sectors can use as a sort of first basis to see what is there to help them, what they have to comply with, and sort of trying to understand with clearer terms how to do it. Basically, it's a starting point, and we're working already with member states on it. And replying to your question, Julia, of course, pulling, if you talk about trade unions, the workers and so on, of course, we will work and are already talking closely to the ILO, to OECD, to ITC, to different partners, so that they can bring these connections. Clearly, the ILO, the connections with the worker and trade union and so on, so involve them into the topics and the practice of it. And that's very much what we try to do. So a big task in terms of coordinating, but trying to pool the different resources and the different actors there, so that we simplify and we bring a bit more coherence to it, and that for the actors, meaning farmers, SMEs, work, and so on, they have an easier understanding of what are the different bits and pieces and how they can put it into practice. And as I said before, embed it into the way that they will do business also.
Many thanks, Cecile, also for touching upon the other issues. And I would like to directly ask Caroline and then Axel to follow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are two things that I would like to say in answer to your question, maybe not entirely, just focus on those questions. One is from the point of the legislation and the package that's being designed in the EU. I think for companies to be able to do this right, consistency is very important. And then I mean consistency with other legislation that we already have in place in the EU. We have the CSRD and some other things, all dealing with similar issues, but also consistency between member states. Of course, many countries are working, looking closely at the EU legislation, but also doing their bit nationally. And I'm just hoping that we can inform each other closely and be in touch so that this is as coherent and consistent as can be across the EU. Also because level playing field is important. And then from the perspective of what can companies do themselves, I think, and what can governments do, providing information, the help desk, the one-stop shop, being accessible, being able to share best practices, because a lot of companies already are doing quite a lot on this topic and may very well be able to, if we design the right instrument, to help others in setting a step forward. Those were the things I would like to add at this point. Thanks.
Thank you. In light of the time, I'll hand directly over to Axel.
Yeah, I see that we are running out of time, so I don't want to repeat what others have said already. I think Cecile has already outlined the approach of this European initiative, and I think we really try to support this because we strongly believe in that. I think in times in which we expect rather tighter budgets in the years to come concerning the financial envelopes we can manage, I'm pretty sure that coordination and really creating the synergies among projects is absolutely key. I think this is not only true probably what we would think of offering to the business communities in Europe. So the term help desk and one-stop shop has been mentioned several times, but I think it's equally true for what we are doing in the countries. I think, as I said earlier, I think this is very much key that in a joint approach of development cooperation would also have a framework and a structure of how to support different countries in creating the frameworks and creating the environment for a proper integration in this development now. And I think we are really trying to support that, including, by the way, Monique has mentioned that as well, including also tailor-made support measures for the local suppliers, for the actual companies, because we see there is a need for financing instruments for sure, if you want to make a difference. Last word on digital issues. I think this hasn't been mentioned today, but I think from our experiences is absolutely key. Today, all stakeholders work fully digitally, and I think it's really key that we have something to offer here. A one-stop shop today, of course, ought to be a proper digital one-stop shop, and then I think the companies will find their way and the information they need. Thank you.
Thank you. Monique, you have the last word, and then I'm closing.
Yeah, well, I'll keep it very short. I build upon what the other speakers say, and I think it's just very important that the European Union complements as much as possible the existing frameworks, so to make sure that we really help catalyze change as opposed to creating further fragmentation. So working together with the frameworks and the initiatives that are already there, build upon best practices is key.
A lot to build on. I will...
on best practices is key, yeah.
Sorry for jumping in too quickly. A lot to build on is what I wanted to just sum up, and thank you so much for that discussion on the third panel, and I would directly hand over to Phil again.
Okay.
Thanks very much. That's great. Really Such an exciting panel to listen to. Thank you very much, Julia, Cecile, Axel, Monique, and Caroline. I think there's just so much there, but we've got so little time now. I'll go straight to our final speaker to close the event. We have Dr. Carsten Stender with us, who's the Director General for European and International Employment and Social Policy and Digital Transformation at the German Ministry for Labour and Social Affairs. So, Dr. Carsten Stender, please, over to you.
Thank you, Phil. Well, it was really a rewarding conference looking on CSDD from a development policy perspective. And as someone coming from labor and social policy, I have to confess, I really learned a lot. And what's even more, I've gained political courage. I mean, many people sense a state's loss of power in the global era. Many people do not believe anymore that things can be changed, neither by parliaments nor by governments or international institutions. I think an impactful EU due diligence legislation is about proving them wrong. The crucial task behind our efforts is to reestablish the confidence of people that the world can be shaped in self-determination and solidarity. Global capitalism is characterized by a lack of democracy and justice. Therefore, we as German government do find for a social response to global injustice in our own country, in Europe, and in the world. I'm thankful and fortunate that our dear colleagues from BMZ organized this fruitful exchange. Our ministries are close political partners, and we both clearly pursue a justice-based approach, or should I say a human rights-based approach in international labor policy, as well as in the development track. This is a political project that goes to the heart of both ministers, I know. It is because they both perceive it as part of the labor movement's moral and historical mission. A policy that derives from a political tradition going back to Marie Schley and Rainer Offergeld, the federal ministers of development in the 70s and early 80s. Dear colleagues, in 1982, 4 decades ago, the German Bundestag concluded a parliamentary decision. It says, the realization of human rights is to be an essential goal of our development policy. Germany should pay special attention to social progress and social justice, in particular to compliance with minimum social standards, trade unions, freedom of association, and collective bargaining in developing countries. In addition, the federal government should continue to actively participate in the creation of codes of conduct and ethical rules of behavior for transnationally active companies. End of quote. Dear colleagues, this is what Parliament asked the German federal government to do 40 years ago when I was 10 years old. And this is exactly what we are jointly doing now. A progressive policy towards the global south, a progressive policy that seeks to ensure decent working conditions, living wages, trade unions, organizing rights in companies in the context of value chains and also in the informal sector. In panel 2, we learned about 90% of hidden workers. In Brussels, Germany is currently promoting an ambitious general approach on CSDD, as Bärbel made clear right in the beginning. As representatives of the Federal Ministry of Labor, we feel honored to coordinate the file in government and to have the privilege to negotiate it in council. If you're interested, I would like to briefly highlight 3 points under discussion in the council's working party. Points which we regard as especially important in the context of development. First, the scope of corporate social responsibility in the current EU legislation. We know that human rights are being violated in the entire value chain. This is true both for upstream chains, for example, in the field of raw material extraction, and also for downstream chains, for example, in the context of the disposal of environmentally harmful waste. Corporate social responsibility must therefore cover the entire value chain. I'm glad this is now part of the Commission's proposal, and the federal government of Germany is supportive on this these days. Second, access to remedy. As Rachel and Bärbel and Mamadou Diallo and many others pointed out, we clearly have to improve the access to legal compensation. There must be a realistic opportunity for the victims to bring an action for compensation before the member states' courts. We can achieve this by making member states' compensation legislation also applicable to damage occurring abroad. That is exactly the point we are promoting in Brussels at the moment, and I'm very happy that the entire federal government supports our efforts. That has not always been the case, unfortunately. Third, the concept of enablement before withdrawal. As we discussed at the end of panel 1, supply chain laws must be designed to encourage companies to also operate in countries where the human rights situation is difficult. After all, we want not only governments, but also companies to be involved in promoting living standards and technological progress in developing countries. If, for example, a company encounters poor working conditions or insufficient occupational safety measures, it should use its influence to improve these conditions to the best of its ability. This is the meaning of the principle of enablement before withdrawal. Instead of withdrawing early, it is important to search for solutions together with suppliers first. This adds to what Alex reported from Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, cut and run versus stay and behave. But, and that's clear too, there must be limits where it becomes inevitable to terminate business relations as a last resort. We are advocating for clear regulations in Brussels modeled in order to provide guidance and legal certainty for companies operating in unstable countries in particular. This is essential to ensure coherence to development policy, I believe. Dear colleagues, this conference really showed that a proper CSDD directive alone won't be enough to improve working and living conditions along global value chains. Additional actions are to be taken from the development perspective. Our joint strategy on accompanying measures should be formulated in a way that promotes ownership in the global South. Therefore, we are regarding developing countries as partners in international politics, and therefore EU member states should act accordingly. This is more than just a call for fair economic cooperation. It means to support the South to involve on equal terms in global government structures and in the international financial and economic institutions. International institutions and organizations like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization must be measured with the yardstick of sustainability and the rights of working people. My minister stands ready to work on a stronger ILO supervisory system, which would help us a lot in practice, I believe. And I know Svenja Schulze is working on our joint idea to better anchor the core labor standards in decisions of the World Bank and other international institutions. As Cecile from the European Commission was putting it, coordination is not at an optimum yet. I'm sure this conference provided us with new ideas, and I'm very much looking forward to continuing our discussions and our fruitful political cooperation. This is why I gained political courage through this conference. The great task of this century is to shape globalization by democratic policy, and this is what such conferences contribute to. Once again, many thanks to BMZ for organizing the conference. Many thanks to Phil and his colleagues being such perfect moderators. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic, Carsten. And thanks also for that call for political courage. I mean, Didier Reynders started this whole process by saying that he was seeking a transformation of the European business model. And I think in those closing remarks, you've really expressed that. It's just now to me really to thank everyone who's made this conference possible. First of all the speakers and moderators who shared their insights and experience with us. Thank you especially, I think, to the leadership and the organizers in BMZ who've made this event possible. And finally, also thanks to all the audience and audience members for your attendance today, and thanks for your interest in this sustainable development aspects of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. I think we've heard so much today that to take away from us. Thank you very much.